Have you ever looked at someone you love and realized you were actually looking at a stranger? Someone whose skin you've touched and whose secrets you thought you held, only to find out there was a whole other life beating inside them, one that didn't include you. I think about that a lot lately. I think about how trust isn't this solid, unbreakable thing, but more like a thin sheet of ice we all agree to walk on because we're too afraid to see how deep the water is underneath. For 10 years, I walked on that ice with Mark. I thought I knew the sound of his footsteps, the way he breathed when he was happy, the way he looked at me across a dinner table. But that night, as I sat across from him and my sister, Sarah, the ice finally gave way. It wasn't a sudden crack. It was more like a slow, freezing soak that started at my feet and worked its way up to my heart. The dinner started out so normal, or at least, the kind of normal we had curated over a decade. The smell of roasted chicken hung in the air, and the candlelight was soft, blurring the edges of a room I had spent years making into a home. Mark was quiet, but he was always a bit reserved, and Sarah, my only sister, the person who shared my childhood and my blood, was unusually vibrant. She kept smoothing her hair and glancing at him, a nervous energy radiating off her that I initially mistook for excitement about her new job. I remember reaching for my wine glass, feeling a strange, hollow thud in my chest, a physical intuition that something was fundamentally wrong with the geometry of the room. It was the way they weren't looking at me, but were looking through me, as if I were already a ghost in my own dining room. I keep replaying that moment, wondering if I could have stopped what came next if I had just said something sooner, or if some betrayals are just written into the script long before the actors ever take the stage. It's funny how you can be so close to someone and still be miles away from the truth of who they really are. Is it possible to truly know another person, or do we just fall in love with the masks they wear for us? I'm still trying to figure that out. I didn't have to wait long for the mask to slip. Mark didn't even wait for dessert. He just set his fork down, the silver clinking against the china with a finality that made my skin cold. He looked at Sarah, not at me, and that was the first real blow, the way he sought permission from her eyes before he destroyed my life. Then he said it. He was leaving me, but he wasn't just leaving. He was moving across the hall of my life and into hers. The words felt like heavy, blunt objects hitting the table. He started talking about soulmates and inevitability, using this clinical, rehearsed logic to explain why betraying a wife of 10 years was actually a brave act of self-discovery. It was nauseating. He looked at me then, his face completely devoid of the warmth I'd spent a decade cultivating, and told me that life was too short to live a lie. As if our entire marriage had been a chore he was finally ticking off a list. But it was Sarah's voice that really broke something inside me. I expected shame, or at least a flicker of the sisterly bond we'd shared since we were girls. Instead, she reached across the table and took his hand right in front of me, a gesture so casual and so cruel it felt like she was staking a claim on a piece of my own body. She told me she hoped I could be grown up about this. She said they hadn't planned for it to happen, but that the heart wants what it wants, as if a Hallmark quote could somehow sanitize the fact that she was stealing my husband while eating the dinner I'd cooked. I sat there watching their fingers interlace, and I realized they had turned me into a villain in their little romance just to make themselves feel better. To them, I wasn't a person anymore. I was just an obstacle they had finally cleared. The betrayal wasn't just the affair. It was the way they sat there, so smug and satisfied, expecting me to bleed quietly so they didn't have to feel guilty about the mess. They had spent months, maybe years, rewriting our history while I was busy living it. Looking at them, I didn't see my husband or my sister anymore. I saw two predators who had finished their meal and were waiting for me to leave the table. It's a strange thing, watching the two people you trust most in the world turn into the people who want to see you disappear. Please subscribe if you've ever felt like the last person to know your own life story. It helps to know I'm not alone in this silence. I thought the floor was the bottom, but I hadn't accounted for my parents. When I called them, shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone, I expected a sanctuary. I expected my mother to gasp, to drive over, to let me collapse into her lap like I did when I was 6. Instead, there was this long, suffocating silence. Then my father's voice came through, heavy and tired, not with grief for me, but with exhaustion at the drama. He told me that life isn't a fairy tale, and that Sarah has always been the sensitive one, the one who needed a little more help finding her way. My mother chimed in on the other line, her voice thin and sharp, telling me to just accept it for the sake of family peace. She actually suggested that if I made a scene, I'd be the one tearing the family apart, not the two people who had just set my world on fire. The isolation was physical. It felt like a thick, gray fog rolling into the room, erasing everything I thought I knew about unconditional love. I realized then that in their eyes, I was the strong one, the one who could handle the weight, which apparently gave everyone else the license to crush me. They weren't coming to save me because they had already decided that my sister's happiness was worth the price of my soul. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, listening to the muffled sounds of Mark and Sarah in the guest room, their hushed giggles, the clicking of a suitcase, and I realized I was completely alone in a house that was no longer mine. My own parents were willing to let me drown just so Sarah didn't have to feel the splash. It's a terrifying moment when you realize your safety net is actually a shroud. I wasn't just losing a husband, I was losing my entire origin story. Everything was being rewritten in real time, and I was being cast as the bitter, discarded woman who just needed to move on quietly. But as I sat there in that silence, something shifted. The shaking stopped. If the people who were supposed to love me didn't care about my survival, then I didn't have to care about their rules. If I was going to be alone, I was going to be the most dangerous thing in the room. What do you do when your own blood tells you that your pain is an inconvenience? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, because that night, I stopped being a daughter and a wife, and I started being a strategist. The coldness that settled in wasn't like the shock from earlier. It was a sharpening of the senses. I stayed awake all night, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in my life, I looked at my memories without the rose-colored tint of loyalty. It's funny how betrayal acts like a chemical developer on an old photograph. Suddenly, things that were blurry become agonizingly clear. I remembered the way Sarah would linger a second too long when Mark hugged her hello. I remembered the business trips, where Mark would come home smelling of a perfume I didn't own, but that I'd seen on Sarah's vanity just weeks before. I even remembered the time my mother told me I should be more adventurous for Mark, implying that if he strayed, it would be my lack of effort that pushed him. Every red flag I had ignored out of a sense of duty now felt like a hot coal pressed against my skin. I hadn't been unlucky. I had been groomed for this moment by people who relied on my kindness to keep their secrets safe. This realization didn't make me cry. Instead, it made me feel a strange, terrifying sense of lightness. The core wound, the belief that I was only valuable if I was keeping everyone else happy, finally stopped bleeding and started to scar over, thick and insensitive. I looked at the wedding photo on my nightstand, the one where we all looked so radiant, and I saw it for what it was, a staged lie. Mark hadn't fallen in love with Sarah yesterday. They had been building a bridge over my head while I was busy building a life for us. The anger that rose up wasn't the screaming kind. It was quiet. It was tactical. I realized that they were all counting on my goodness. They were counting on me to be the bigger person, to sign the papers, to take the small settlement, and to disappear into the night so they could play house without the guilt. They thought my love for them was a leash they could pull. They didn't realize that when you cut the leash, the dog doesn't just run away. Sometimes, it remembers exactly where the gate is left open. I spent the hours before dawn reevaluating every joint asset, every password, and every legal loophole I had access to as the primary breadwinner and the one who managed our entire digital life. By 4:00 a.m., I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a ghost haunting a house that didn't know it was already dead. By 5:00 a.m., the air in the house felt different, thinner, sharper. I sat at the small mahogany desk in the den, the one Mark never used because he said it was too cramped, and I felt a strange, surgical detachment. The weeping woman from 2 hours ago was gone, replaced by someone who looked at her life like a spreadsheet that needed balancing. I realized that Mark and Sarah were operating on a narrative of passion, but I was operating on a narrative of infrastructure. They had the feelings, but I had the keys. For years, I had been the one who handled the taxes, the one who consolidated the investments, and the one whose name sat first on every legal document because I was the one with the credit score that actually meant something. Mark had always been happy to let me handle the boring stuff, while he spent his salary on gear for hobbies he never finished. He thought my competence was a service I provided him. He never realized it was a weapon I was hunting. I didn't feel guilty. That was the most surprising part. I thought I'd feel a twinge of betrayal for what I was about to do, but as I logged into our joint wealth management portal, all I felt was a profound sense of justice. They wanted a fresh start. Fine, but a fresh start shouldn't be funded by the person you've just tried to incinerate. I began the process of moving the liquid assets into a private account I'd established years ago for my personal inheritance, money that was legally mine, but that I'd kept in the joint pool out of a naive sense of oneness. Not anymore. I watched the numbers migrate across the screen, a digital exodus of every cent of security we had built together. I wasn't just taking money, I was taking their future. I was taking the down payment for the house they'd probably already scouted. I was taking the safety net they assumed I would provide while they fumbled through their new, illicit romance. It was the first time in years I felt like I was in control of my own breathing. I was no longer waiting for the blow to land. I was the one swinging the hammer. The emotional fog had lifted, leaving behind a cold, crystalline map of exactly how to dismantle the life they thought they were entitled to. The silence of the house at 6:00 a.m. was absolute, a heavy, velvet quiet that felt like a secret between me and the walls. I moved through the digital hallways of our life with a precision that was almost beautiful. Every click of the mouse was a stitch pulled out of our shared history. Mark had always been so careless with his passwords, using the same string of numbers, our anniversary, ironically enough, for everything from his email to the high-yield savings account where we'd tucked away my last 3 annual bonuses. He treated our joint finances like a magic well that would never run dry, never bothering to understand the mechanics of the plumbing. I sat there, the blue light of the laptop reflecting in my eyes, and systematically drained every reservoir. I moved the savings, the rainy day fund, and the shared investment dividends. I didn't just move the money, I closed the lines of credit he relied on for his overpriced lifestyle. It was a digital scorched earth policy. It's a strange sensation, watching a decade of us dissolve into a series of zero-balance notifications. I felt like a ghost stripping a house of its copper wiring before the new owners could move in. My heart wasn't racing. If anything, it was beating slower than it had in years. I was reclaiming the labor of my hands and the foresight of my mind. For years, I had been the architect of our stability, building a floor beneath his feet so he could stand tall and look around for someone else. I realized that by taking this money, I wasn't being greedy. I was simply removing the floor. I was letting him experience the gravity he'd been exempt from for 10 years. By the time the sun started to bleed through the curtains, the joint accounts were hollowed-out shells. I felt a cold, clean surge of power as I realized that while they were upstairs dreaming of their new beginning, I had already ensured it would start in a state of absolute bankruptcy. I closed the laptop with a soft thud that sounded like a coffin lid closing. The morning was coming, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the light. I was the one who controlled the dawn. By 7:00 a.m., I was moving with a phantom-like efficiency. I didn't pack a suitcase for myself. I packed their lives into the hallway. I took Mark's designer suits and Sarah's expensive silk dresses, half of which I'd bought her for her birthdays, and I piled them near the front door like a mountain of discarded skin. The house felt larger now, emptier, as if it were exhaling. I walked to the garage and looked at the car Mark had insisted we lease in both our names, though I was the one who made the monthly payments. I called the agency and reported it as a domestic dispute, authorizing an immediate repossession based on the clause I'd specifically insisted on during the signing, the one that allowed either party to terminate the lease if the other abandoned the primary residence. He hadn't technically abandoned it yet, but by the time the tow truck arrived, the narrative would be mine. I felt a grim, quiet satisfaction as I watched the garage door slide shut for what I knew was the last time for them. Then came the final seal. I had called a 24-hour locksmith at dawn, explaining that my husband had moved out and I needed the security of my home restored. He was a quiet man, efficient and incurious, which was exactly what I needed. As he worked, the metallic asterisk snick asterisk of the new tumblers falling into place sounded like a rhythmic heartbeat. I stood on the porch, the morning air biting at my skin, watching him hand over the new set of keys. They were cold and heavy in my palm, the weight of my new boundaries. My parents' keys wouldn't work. Mark's key wouldn't work. Sarah's spare wouldn't work. I was building a fortress out of a crime scene. I walked back inside and engaged the deadbolts, leaning my forehead against the cool wood of the door. Outside, the world was waking up, but inside this house, the past was officially locked out. I could hear the faint sound of a shower starting upstairs. Mark, beginning his day, oblivious to the fact that the very ground he was standing on had already been sold from under him. I didn't feel like a wife anymore. I felt like an owner, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't sharing the deed. The house was beginning to stir, but it was a clumsy, ignorant kind of movement. I sat in the kitchen, a single cup of black coffee steaming in front of me, watching the clock on the oven tick toward 8:00 a.m. I heard the floorboards groan upstairs, Mark's heavy, confident stride. Then came the lighter, hurried footsteps of my sister. They were probably whispering about their escape, planning their grand exit to a hotel or some rented love nest they thought I'd be too broken to protest. I didn't move. I didn't hide. I just sat there in the silence, savoring the last few minutes of their delusion. It's a powerful thing, knowing exactly when someone's world is going to end while they're still busy brushing their teeth. I felt like a spectator at a play I had rewritten in the middle of the night, waiting for the actors to realize their scripts were blank. The air was thick with the scent of my coffee and the metallic tang of the new keys resting on the table. Every sound from upstairs, the zipping of a bag, the muffled laughter, felt like a desperate, hollow echo. They thought they were the protagonists of a daring romance, but from where I sat, they looked like two children playing in a house that had already been foreclosed on. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It was steady, a slow and rhythmic drumbeat of anticipation. I looked out the window and saw the tow truck pull into the driveway, as quiet as a predator. The driver didn't even need to knock. I'd already left the paperwork in the visor of the car as I'd planned. I watched through the blinds as the steel arms of the truck slid under the vehicle they'd planned to use for their getaway. There was a faint, mechanical hum, and just like that, their mobility was gone. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the bitterness grounding me. The stage was set. The doors were locked, the money was gone, and the car was disappearing down the street. I stayed perfectly still, listening for the sound of their footsteps coming down the stairs, waiting for the moment the silence of the house would finally meet the silence of their future. It was the most peaceful I had felt in a decade. The sound of them coming down the stairs was a series of heavy thuds, like something falling apart in slow motion. They reached the foyer, arms laden with bags, faces glowing with that sickening, new life radiance that only people who have successfully destroyed someone else can wear. Mark didn't even look at me as he reached for the front door handle. He was too busy telling Sarah where they'd stop for breakfast. But then the click happened, or rather, the lack of it. He turned the handle and it didn't budge. He frowned, jiggling it, then reached for his key, trying to force it into a lock that no longer recognized him. I watched from the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame with my coffee. The confusion on his face was almost comical, a slow-motion realization that the world wasn't bending to his will anymore. "The lock is stuck," he muttered, his voice tightening. Sarah stood behind him, her eyes darting to me, the first flicker of genuine fear finally breaking through her smugness. Then Mark's phone buzzed, a notification from the bank. I watched his skin go from a healthy post-shower pink to a gray, ashen white in a matter of seconds. He stopped breathing for a moment, his thumb frantic on the screen, scrolling through a history of 0 after 0. He looked at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, the words, "Where is the money?" dying in his throat before they could even form. There was no dignity in it, no grand romantic defiance. Just the raw, ugly panic of a man who realized he'd traded his soul for a woman who was now looking at him like he was a sinking ship. Sarah realized it too. She wasn't looking at Mark with love anymore. She was looking at the empty hallway and the locked door, her mind likely calculating the cost of the designer shoes she was wearing. The hysteria set in when Mark looked out the side window and saw the empty space where the car had been. He started pounding on the door, screaming that I couldn't do this, that this was illegal, but his voice sounded thin and hollow in the vastness of the house I still owned. I didn't say a word. I just let the silence of their consequences fill the room until it was loud enough to drown out their screams. Seeing them reduced to this, two panicked animals trapped in a cage of their own making, wasn't just satisfying, it was clarifying. This wasn't a tragedy, It was an eviction. Mark finally turned away from the door, his face twisted in a way I'd never seen, a mixture of desperate rage and the realization that he was suddenly powerless. He started packing the foyer, his expensive leather boots clicking on the hardwood I had polished just last week. "Give me the keys, Alina," he demanded, trying to find that old authoritative tone he used when he wanted to end an argument. "You're acting like a child. We have a life to start, and you can't just steal our money." I almost laughed. The hour felt like a ghost limb, a part of a body that had already been amputated. I just set my coffee cup down on the counter and looked him dead in the eye. "It isn't your money, Mark. It was the interest on my inheritance, my bonuses, and the savings I managed while you were buying watches you couldn't afford. You didn't want the boring responsibility of the accounts, remember? You wanted the freedom. Well, congratulations, you're free." Sarah stepped forward then, her voice trembling, trying to play the role of the peacemaker. "Alina, please. We don't have anywhere to go. Mom and Dad said we could stay with them later, but we need to get there. Just give us the car keys." She actually reached out as if to touch my arm, and I stepped back with a visceral shudder. The sheer audacity of her, the sister who had shared my bed as a child and my husband as an adult, asking me for a favor, was the final nail. "The car is gone, Sarah. And as for Mom and Dad, I'm sure they'll be happy to host you, but you'll be walking. Or maybe you can call an Uber. Oh, wait." I gestured to Mark's phone, which was still lighting up with alerts about his frozen credit lines. "I forgot. Your digital footprint just vanished." The shift in the room was palpable. The romantic bubble hadn't just popped. It had turned into a vacuum, sucking the air out of their lungs. Mark wasn't looking at me with anger anymore. He was looking at me with a pathetic, crawling kind of pleading. He started talking about fairness and decades of history, trying to negotiate for a life he had just spent the night throwing away. I didn't engage. I didn't yell. I just stood there, a silent wall of no, watching the two of them realize that for the first time in their lives, their charm and their lies weren't going to buy them a way out of the cold. The phone calls started around 9:00 a.m., but I didn't answer. I could see my mother's name flashing on the screen, followed by my father, but I just watched the phone vibrate across the granite countertop like a dying insect. They had finally heard from the happy couple, who were currently sitting on the curb outside my front gate with their designer suitcases, waiting for a bus that wasn't coming. I knew exactly what my parents were going to say, the same tired script about family blood and not being vindictive. So I did something I should have done years ago. I sent a single group text to the extended family, the neighbors, and our mutual friends. It wasn't a rant. It was a cold, clinical summary of the night's events, complete with the bank statements showing Mark's attempt to withdraw the last of our shared funds at 7:45 a.m. I attached a photo of them sitting on the sidewalk, looking like two disgraced tourists in their own neighborhood. The truth travels faster than a lie when it's backed by receipts. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of isolation anymore. It was the silence of a vacuum where a reputation used to be. My mother's calls stopped. My father sent one final text. "You've embarrassed us." I didn't reply that they had embarrassed themselves by raising a thief and marrying me off to a coward. I just blocked them. I watched through the security camera feed on my tablet as a taxi finally pulled up to the curb. Mark tried to put the bags in the trunk, but I saw the driver stop him, likely because Mark's card was declined. I watched as my sister, the sensitive one, had to dig through her purse to find enough crumpled cash to pay for a ride to my parents' house. They looked small. They looked cheap. The small-town grapevine was already buzzing. By noon, the epic love story they'd tried to sell was being laughed at in every coffee shop in a 10-mile radius. I had stripped them of their dignity, their mobility, and their narrative. They weren't a tragedy anymore. They were a cautionary tale. I sat back in my quiet, empty house and felt the weight of the last 10 years lift off my shoulders. The truth didn't just set me free. It burned the bridge behind me so they could never crawl back. It's 10:00 a.m. now, and the house has never been this quiet. It's not the lonely silence I feared when they first said those words at the dinner table. It's the peaceful, humming silence of a machine that's finally running correctly. I walked through the rooms, opening the windows to let the spring air sweep out the scent of that roasted chicken and the lingering, stale energy of their betrayal. I stopped in front of the mirror in the hallway. The one Sarah used to check her reflection in every time she visited, and I didn't see a victim. I saw a woman who had finally paid her own ransom. There is a specific kind of calm that comes when you realize that the people who were supposed to protect you are the ones you had to survive. I feel lighter, as if I've shed a skin that was 2 sizes too small. The money sits in my private account, a digital fortress that ensures I will never have to ask anyone for permission to exist ever again. It isn't about greed. It's about the fact that I am no longer funding the destruction of my own life. I heard later that they're living in my parents' basement, the soulmates, sleeping on a twin mattress, while my mother tries to explain to the neighbors why her daughters aren't speaking. Mark is looking for work, but in a town this small, word of a man who tried to bankrupt his wife before leaving her for her sister tends to precede him. They have each other, which is exactly what they said they wanted. I find a soft, crystalline satisfaction in knowing they have to stare at each other every day in that cramped basement and realize that the cost of their passion was everything else they ever valued. They are tethered to each other by a shared shame now, not love. As for me, I sat on my porch this evening with a glass of wine, watching the sunset bleed over the driveway where their car used to be. I'm not waiting for an apology, and I'm not looking for closure. I built my own closure out of steel and numbers. I lost a husband and a sister, but I found the woman I was always meant to be before I started making myself small for them. And honestly, it was a bargain.